Trying to predict the future is like trying to drive down a country road at night with no lights while looking out the back window. Peter Drucker.
Are you ready to make the most of the only life you have? To make smart money choices focused on achieving what you care about most? Here to help you balance living well today without sacrificing your tomorrow is the Retirement Answer Man, Roger Whitney.
So there's one thing that I really hate about going to the doctor. It's not getting the shot of antibiotics or getting my blood drawn or all those types of things. The thing that I don't like most about going to the doctor is the thing that they do right when you walk back with the nurse as you're going to the room. And that is they weigh you. They get you on a scale because they want to update your weight on your chart. Now, the reason I hate that is not so much because I'm worried about my weight, but what I don't like is the scale in my doctor's office is measures about 8 pounds heavier than the scale that I use at home. So I go on my scale every day. It says I'm about 192. And then every time I go to the doctor, it says I'm like 200 or 203, which is really annoying. Now, I'm fully clothed, but my clothes don't weigh that much. So when you look at a scale gives you data about where you're at and all of the things that have happened in terms of your exercise and your nutrition and everything else beforehand. It's the sum of that, right? Of all those decisions. But every scale that you go on is inaccurate. None of them are really giving your true weight, at least the scales that are out there commercially. Everyone is different. Like my doctor's scale is different than my, $150 scale that I have at home. So the question becomes, what value is there in the data of an inaccurate scale? Because maybe if I'm worried about my weight or self-conscious, maybe I just switch scales. I hop from scale to find the scale that fits to how I perceive the world and how I perceive myself. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That seems a little bit silly because that's not going to be a great way to make decisions. Now, wouldn't it be cool if they had a programmable scale, a scale where, okay, you weigh this today, however inaccurate that number is, but you get to program and skew the data based on what you see your future exercise and nutritional behavior be, right? So if you weigh, in my case, 192, according to my scale, but I know I'm going to be exercising and eating better in the future, and you can see those trends happening already. What if I just program the scale to skew my future weight so I can act based on that number? Does that make sense? That seems sort of silly too, doesn't it? Because it hasn't happened yet, and you don't know if you're going to exercise like you think you will, and you don't know if you're going to eat as healthy as you think you will. So that doesn't make any sense. So hopping from scale to scale doesn't help you, and skewing the scale for future possible behavior doesn't really make a lot of sense. So what is one to do when they're worried about or trying to manage their weight? Well, if you use one scale consistently, even if the data is inaccurate, it will be consistently inaccurate data. So as you get more data from weighing yourself year after year or week after week, you'll still be able to understand the trends of whether you're losing weight, gaining weight, or staying the same. So the key might be just to have one scale, as inaccurate as it is, so you can use that to make better decisions for you. So, okay, why are we talking about all this? Well, today we are going to we're going to dive in anyway, into what scale or what assumptions we're using in our asset allocation models to help us make better investment decisions so we can create a great retirement. But we can't do any of that until we have this important disclaimer. Time for that all-important disclaimer, and with investing especially, it's more important than ever. Realize we're going to be talking about indexes. You cannot invest in an index. You can only buy vehicles that mimic indexes. We're going to be talking about different types of investments possibly, and realize every investment has a different return potential and risk potential. And when we talk returns, it all happened in the past, and that does not predict future results. So there's no guarantees there. All of this is helpful hints in education. Before you make any decisions, make sure you talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor, because that's just common sense. Now, let's talk about that programmable scale and how accurate that could be in our Hot Topic segment. Well, since we're going to be talking about the assumptions that we use to build these asset allocation models today, I think it's important to give some perspective on gurus and market predictions and market forecasts. How accurate can they actually be? There's a really good article, actually about 4 years ago, in Forbes titled, "It's Official, Gurus Cannot Accurately Predict Markets." They talk about CXO Advisory Group, which was collecting data since 1998. They since have stopped this survey, tracking and grading thousands of market forecasts made by dozens of popular gurus. So, with over a decade of data and over 6,400 forecasts, what they found was that the consistent 48% accuracy rate was achieved by market gurus, meaning that about 48% of them actually got their predictions correct. The best performing guru over the period of time that they were monitoring the data had a 68.2% grade, and the worst had a 21.7% grade. And of course, they call out in the article, Jim Cramer of Mad Money had about a 46.8% accuracy rate based on about 62 market predictions. Now, CXO has since stopped collecting this data and making grades, but I think this is very instructive for us because most investment firms and bluntly most investors are enamored and focus and influence their decisions heavily on market forecasts of what's going to happen over the next year, the next 3 years, the next 5 years. So we're going to get into that a little bit. But before we get to the practical planning segment, I want to share a couple quotes that I think put a good spotlight on how some in the industry even view market forecasts. As one newsletter guru told me years ago, according to the article, given a choice between great marketing and great forecasting, I'd pick great marketing every time. Another quote from the article, "Forecasting isn't about predicting the market. It's about marketing the prediction." So that gives you some insight into how forecasters and newsletter writers themselves view the art of forecasting markets. CBS News reported Jane Hertzuz, at the time the chief economist of Goldman Sachs, talking about the value of economic forecasts. And she said, according to the article, "Nobody has a clue. It's hugely difficult to forecast the business cycle. Understanding an organism as complex as the economy or the markets is very hard." So generally, the forecasters themselves don't give much credence to the accuracy of their forecast. So the question comes to you and I when we're building an asset allocation model or building an investment strategy, how much do we skew data in light of what we see happening in the future, and who should we rely on? That's a really important decision that we need to dive into in our practical planning segment. Well, welcome to the next installment of the Investing for Retirement series. We are on week 4 on building a robust knowledge and process so we can actually invest, hopefully successfully, for a great retirement. We've done a lot so far. We looked at historically what the returns have been on stocks and bonds. And then we introduced the idea of, well, we know we don't get that return every single year, that average return. So we introduced the idea of risk and how you manage risk with asset allocation. And we dove deep into that. And then last week, we talked about how although asset allocation may work really well for the accumulation stage when we're just saving and investing, and it works really well for institutions that have unlimited time horizons, there are some wrinkles that come into play when we're investing during retirement. Our timeline is a lot shorter and we're taking money out, if not systematically, fairly consistently, and that changes the equation a little bit. What I want to talk about today is that return assumption, because that can really skew the kind of decisions that we make. Now, Mike, a listener, emailed a question about the Kim and Joe Retirement Plan Live series, which really sets up this discussion well. So let me read you what Mike wrote. He says, in your retirement planning process with Kim and Joe, it appeared you were using investment return assumptions based on historical averages. However, I've heard a number of commentators such as John Bogle, the legendary founder of Vanguard, and David Stein, the legendary host of Money for the Rest of Us, advise folks to use return assumptions that are much lower than historical return averages. So Mike wants to know, is it really safe to base our retirement plan on assumed returns that are near historical averages? That's a really good question, Mike. So let's dive into that a little bit. So if we're going to talk about what return assumption to use, let's talk about how an asset allocation model is built. So I want to review this real quickly. So when you put in your risk profile based on those risk questionnaires, and we know how inaccurate those are, so that's one level, it goes into a statistical model called an optimizer, which is just a computer model, and it has 4 inputs or assumptions in it that help create the asset allocation recommendation for you. And this is what everybody uses. It's going to have the return assumption, the average return historically, or the average return for every asset class in the model. That could be stocks, it could be large, small, bonds, cash, all the rest. Whatever asset classes are in the model, it'll have that return assumption. And then for each one of those, it's also going to have the standard deviation. We talked about that. That's the risk of the variability around that average return historically. And then it's going to have the correlation, which is a relative measure, which says, okay, when one asset class does this historically, how does the other asset class react? And then the last is that assessment of how much risk you're willing to take. And then it uses all those inputs and assumptions to create a asset allocation pie chart that's appropriate for you, with the goal being to maximize the potential return for a given level of risk. So we're focusing on this return assumption today. How do we determine what return assumption to put in there? Do we just use the data, or do we have to think about the future? So let's go back to that scale analogy. So if we're just using the data, that's what scale do we use to come up with that number? One scale would be you just use all the data for the asset classes that you're going to invest in. So for U.S. stocks, that might go back to 1926. That's where most people go back to when it comes to the S&P 500. People like Jeremy Siegel show data going back hundreds of years, so that you maybe use all that data. I don't know. And then you have some that say, well, maybe we just use some of the data. We don't need all of that. And in the models I use, we go back to 1970, and there's some logic behind that I'll talk about in another time. So those are maybe 2 different scales. You use all the data or you use some of the data, and the numbers will be a little bit different depending on what you decide to do. And then, and this is what Mike references to, there are the programmable scales that I talked about, where we take all of the historical data, so we're still going to have that in there, but then we skew the numbers based on our assessment of the future. So John Bogle, which Mike mentioned in his question, he comes out every year with his forecasted returns for, say, U.S. stocks. And so he takes all the historical data, but then he looks at dividend yield and what the anticipated earnings growth will be, and then nudges that up and down based on whether he thinks there'll be an expansion, or contraction of valuations. He's price to earnings. So he has a secret sauce that he applies on top of the historical data, and that comes up with his market forecast. And there are thousands and thousands of market forecasters. As we talked about in the Hot Topic segment, that's really what most financial firms are in the industry of doing, is doing market forecasts and then selling those forecasts. So let's look at some of the more respected market forecasters. Okay, so we got John Bogle, who is legendary as the founder of Vanguard. The last I saw, for the next decade, his forecast or prediction is that equities, U.S. stocks, will return about 6% a year, and bonds will return about 3% a year. So that's his prediction on the future, which are much lower than what history tells us. Now, another very respected forecaster is a company called GMO, run by Jeremy Grantham. They put out 7-year forecasts for various asset classes. When you look at GMO's predictions or forecasts for the markets, he says U.S. stocks over the next 7 years are going to average 2.1%. So that's a lot lower than John Bogle's, and it's a lot lower than what history has shown us. And then for bonds or fixed income, GMO shows negative average returns every year of about 1% over the next 7 years for bonds. So very pessimistic. So if you follow his train of thought, you would really skew those assumptions down. Josh Peters is another one from Morningstar. They say for equities, it's going to be 6 to 7% for the next few decades. So he's going out almost 20 years. And then you have Rob Arnott from Research Associates, who is a brilliant man. I've met him and spent some time with him. He says over the next 10 years, U.S. stocks will average 1.1% a year. And then bonds will average about 1.1% a year. That's even more pessimistic than Bogle or Jeremy Grantham. And there are thousands of other forecasters. So the question is, who's right? Who is right? Well, we know none of them are right. Just like a scale, when you're getting weighed, virtually no scale is accurate. So which one should we use? So if you use all the data, we know that's not going to be accurate, but we know it's all the data. The hard part with using all the data plus predictions, in my assessment, is predictions are subject to a lot of different things that the data isn't necessarily subject to. That is, it's subject to the bias of the firm or the person making the prediction, to blind spots that that institution or person might have, to how they identify conditions when they change and how they process that. And it's also subject to potentially their ulterior motives for their predictions, because they're all in business selling something. So if we choose to have a programmable scale and base our decisions on not just all the historical data, but in addition to that, predictions about the future, we've just introduced a whole nother layer of uncertainty that we have to deal with, because it's not just all the data. We know that's not accurate, but now we're introducing a whole nother layer of things that we know isn't going to be accurate, that can be skewed by things because we're dealing with people now. So last week in our Hot Topic segment, one of the legends of finance talked about this issue of decumulation, withdrawing from assets to support lifestyle, as one of the nastiest finance problems that nobody has really addressed in any robust way. So asset allocation wasn't created to solve for that. And so if this is one of the nastiest problems, when you're going to go through in retirement and drawing money from your assets, I'm here to tell you, nobody's figured that out. There's not robust research. There's a lot happening with that, but it's not figured out. But you got to be really careful, because this is not an academic exercise, right? What you base your return assumptions on is going to impact when you retire, how much you save, how much you spend, and what kind of lifestyle you're going to live. So you got to be really careful about this. So the question becomes, what do you do? When it comes to the asset allocation decision, here are some of my thoughts. Number one, rather than spend time trying to adjust the data based on researched opinion, I find much more value in guiding clients and working with clients, spending time on how to manage through the uncertainty and managing through all the things that we don't know. So I think forecasting is a little bit of a fool's game, because as bad as historical data is, introducing predictions on the future just introduces a whole nother layer of uncertainty that we're going to be basing life decisions on. And if we're going to base life decisions on a forecast, we better have a very high confidence level that that forecaster is accurate, because we're basing life decisions on this. Because the last thing we want to do is go with a forecaster, base life decisions on it, and then hop to a different forecaster or a different set of assumptions and the different set of assumptions. Now we're scale hopping, and we know how inaccurate that can be. So you better have some high conviction on a forecaster before you make life decisions based off of it. As bad as all the data is, at least the historical data doesn't have that extra layer of uncertainty. And now we can just focus on how do we manage through that? How do we account for the poor quality of the data of just the historical data? So here are some of the ways that I account for that when I'm working with clients. Number one is we stress test spending plans over and over and over again. And we stress them not just against the historical data, but we say, okay, well, what happens if returns have an average that's, handicapped by 1 or 2%. So we can stress test against bad returns without doing all our planning based on forecasts for bad returns. Number two is I don't use a strict asset allocation. So when I'm managing assets with clients, I don't invest purely in a strict asset allocation of indexes or index-like investments. I use a mix of different things, and I'll talk about that in an upcoming episode. So I don't strictly use asset allocation because it wasn't built for retirement in the first place. Number three is I like to focus on the minimum effective dose of investment risk rather than what traditional risk management does, which is focuses on the tolerance, how much you can endure rather than how much you need. That's one way to account for this. And then number four, using my agile retirement management approach, because we know the data is so bad and we can't predict the future, we try to eliminate the unnecessary uncertainties, and then we focus on having lots of little huddles or small conversations to identify changes and make lots of little adjustments focused on the investment decisions being directly tied to the specific life objectives of the person. Now, does that solve it? No, but it seems to be a lot more actionable when we're trying to make investment decisions. So that's how I think about this return assumption, is the data is the least biased and eliminates the uncertainty of trying to figure out which scale or which forecaster to follow, and eliminates the chance of jumping from forecaster to forecaster based on our fear or pessimism. So next week, we're going to dive into this a little bit more and look at asset allocation, but how to build a investment process that fits where we're at in our stage of life, which is retirement. But before we do that, let's have that smart sprint.
On your marks, get set.
Hey, welcome to the Smart Sprint segment where we set a very short 7-day goal, take a little baby step towards creating a great life and retirement. So we're sticking on this investment theme. So we've been having you organize and take a look at your investments. Now, over the next 7 days, I want you to look at your investments and identify what parts of your portfolio are based on market guesses. That's going to be important to know. How much of your portfolio is based on guesses or based on reasoned decisions focused on the goals that you and your family have? Now let's go get happy. Hey, welcome to the Happy Lab, where we noodle on how to live a happier life. On my drive back from Tennessee last week, I got to stop in Texarkana, Texas, and spend some time with one of my favorite podcasters, fellow Spartans and friends, Joel Solsehi of Stacking Benjamins. Now, you may know that Joe is a game board fanatic, and he has made me a game board fanatic, as my wife can attest to when we get Amazon packages at the house. So I got to spend a night at Joe's house. We went down to the basement and recorded an episode of his Stacking Benjamins show, which I love. And then we played some board games. And these are geeky board games, but they're so much fun. So I want to give you the 5 games that I have played that Joe has introduced me to that I love most, and maybe they'll help you have some fun with your family. Number 1 is Code Names, very quick game. Number 2 is Ticket to Ride, both the American and the European version. And then The third game is Puerto Rico, which is like building a little society. Number 4 is Memoir 44, where you actually reenact battles of World War II. And then the last one we just played, which was called Viticulture, which is where you're each competing building wineries. So these are a little bit geeky games. The one thing I like about these games are they're generally about an hour long, so they're not like a risk game. And what I've discovered is, like that breakout room that I talked about, you're interacting with each other, and it's a great way to have a little bit of a distraction and a frame around enjoying each other's company. So if you're into some board games, go check those out. One thing I hear all the time is one of the hardest things about retirement planning is all of the uncertainty and feeling like there's a lack of control about dictating and creating the kind of life you want in retirement. Well, our agile retirement management process brings a lot of clarity and intentionality and structure to the process without trying to figure everything out. And what we have found that people who go through it and then walk life with me, what they end up having is a lot more control and optimism about their life and their retirement. So if you are looking for an advisor to walk that journey with you or help you create a roadmap, I am accepting clients. Go to rogerwhitney.com, set a time to have a conversation, and we can see if it's right for you. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next week, this is Roger Whitney, the Retirement Answer Man.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.